Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere you think you know, but you probably don't. We're traveling back in time to the American Wild West, specifically to its most infamous institution, the saloon. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're picturing John Wayne walking in, swinging doors, a charming piano player in the corner, and maybe a good-natured bar fight where no one really gets hurt. Forget all of it. Tonight, we're peeling back that romantic Hollywood veneer to explore the grimy, desperate, and often dangerous reality of what these places truly were. This is into a story about heroes and charming rogue. It's a story about desperation, survival, and the cheap whiskey that fueled it all. Honestly, you probably wouldn't last the first day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support really does make these late-night journeys possible. And while you read, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see where our little community is scattered across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice isn't the town, but the absence of everything else. You've been traveling for what feels like an eternity. Across a landscape so vast and empty, it seems to have swallowed the sun whole. Now, darkness blankets everything. The air is thin and cold, tearing the clean, earthy scent of dust and distant sagebrush. It is a profound, almost intimidating silence, broken only by the soft crunch of your own boots on the pebbled ground and the low whistle of the wind weaving through unseen canyons. You feel small here, an insignificant speck under a truly breathtaking canopy of stars, more brilliant and numerous than you could ever imagine. They don't twinkle, they burn with a fierce, cold light. Then, you see it, a flicker, a tiny, lonely smudge of yellow light against the infinite black. It's the first sign of human life you've seen in hours, maybe days. As you draw closer, the smudge resolves itself into a small collection of dark, angular shapes huddled together as if for warmth. This is it, the town. It is less a town and more a suggestion of what? A handful of crude wooden boxes dropped unceremoniously into the middle of nowhere. The main street is just a wider, more trampled patch of dirt than the surrounding prairie. There is no welcome sight. There is no cheerful glow from cozy homesteads. There is only the darkness, the wind, and that one defiant block of light. That light, you realize, is coming from a single building. It is a long, two-story wooden structure, looking less like a building and more like a large, hastily constructed crate. Light, a sickly, buzzing yellow, spills from its windows into doorway, cutting a weak rectangle onto the dusty street. It is a beacon, of a sort, but it doesn't promise warmth or safety. It promises noise. It promises company, for better or for worse. It promises a temporary escape from the crushing loneliness of the frontier. This is the town as Saloon. This was a reality for countless settlements in the American West. These weren't planned communities. They were boom towns, settlements that erupted almost overnight around a new mine, a cattle trail crossroads, or a stop on the ever-expanding railroad. And in these raw, chaotic places, the saloon was often the very first, and for a time, the only, public building, before a church, before a proper general store, sometimes even before a sheriff's office. There was the saloon. It was the social and economic heart of the community, a place to make deals, to hear news, and, most importantly, to spend whatever money you had just earned, or perhaps just found. You stand there for a moment, letting your eyes adjust. You can hear a low, muffled thrumming sound coming from inside, a jumble of voices and the tinny, repetitive plinking of a piano. It is the only sound in town, and it draws you in like a moth to a flame, even though every instinct tells you that flames burn. A weird little fact about these places is just how temporary they were built to be. The lumber was often green, unseasoned pine, thrown up in a matter of weeks, designed to serve the boom and then be abandoned when the silver vein ran dry or the cattle doctor moved on. They were disposable architecture for a disposable population. Historians still debate the exact figures, of course, but some accounts from the period suggest that in the most frantic of these boomtowns, the ratio of saloons to other businesses was staggeringly high. It's an almost comical image. A town with 3 saloons, a blacksmith, and not much else. While these claims are probably colored by the moral anxieties of the era, they paint a picture of a society desperate for a place to gather and forget. And that place was right in front of you. You take a hesitant step forward, and then another. The pull of that light and sound is undeniable. As you get closer, the details of the building begin to sharpen, and the romantic image you might have held in your mind starts to rapidly dissolve. Your eyes are drawn upwards, to the sign. In the movies, it is often a handsome, professionally painted piece of woodwork. The reality before you is far more pathetic. Hanging crookedly from one rusty hinge is a single plank of wood, bleached and splintered by the sun and wind. On it, in faded, clumsily applied black paint, are the words P-R-A-I-R-I-R-O-S-P-S-A-L-O-N. The S in rose is backward. The whole thing groans and sways with every gust of wind, a constant, weary complaint against the elements. This wasn't uncommon. The person hired to paint the sign was rarely a professional artist. More likely, it was an itinerant worker who claimed he could handle a brush and was paid with a drink or two. The quality, and indeed the spelling, was a complete lottery. Looking at this sad, lopsided sign, you get the first real sense of the saloon-esque character. It is not about style or pride. It is about function, and only the bare minimum required for it. It needs a name, so it has one. That is it. Your gaze travels down from the sign to the facade of the building itself. This is where you encounter a classic feature of Western architecture, one that is a perfect metaphor for the whole frontier enterprise. The fausse front. The main building is a simple, triangular roofed shed, the most basic structure you can build, but slapped onto the front of it, facing the main street, is a tall, flat, rectangular wall that extends far above the actual roof line. It has a cheap, theatrical trick. From the street, it gives the illusion of a grander, more substantial, 2-story building, the kind you might find back in a civilized eastern city. But walk around the side, and you see the lie. The grand facade is just a thin wall of planks, propped up from behind by a few diagonal beams. It is a mask of prosperity, a wooden lie told to the empty prairie. Historians are still debating the precise motivation behind the ubiquitous false front. Was it a conscious attempt by town boosters to make their fledgling settlement seem more permanent and respectable, a way to attract investment and, perhaps more importantly, families? Or was it purely practical, offering a larger, flatter surface to paint a bigger, more impressive sign on? Some even argue it was just a matter of fashion. One town did it, so the next town copied it, a trend spreading across the West with little thought behind it. Whatever the reason, standing here, looking at the warped boards and the way the wind whistles through the gaps, it feels less like a symbol of ambition and more like one of desperation. It is trying so hard to be something it is not. You step up from the dusty street onto a crude boardwalk. The planks are uneven and rock slightly under your weight. One of them is missing entirely, creating a dark, ankle-twisting trap for the unwary or the inebriated. The wood is rough-sawn, still shedding splinters. You walk carefully, your boots making a hollow sound that seems to echo in the quiet street. You ray close enough now to see the windows on either side of the entrance. They are filmed with a layer of grime, so thick that the light from within is diffused into a blurry, indistinct glow. You can just make out shapes moving inside, shadows passing back and forth, the occasional gesture of an arm, a head tilted back. But it is all vague, like watching a puppet show through a dirty cloth. The smell is stronger here, seeping through the cracks in the walls. It is a complex and not entirely pleasant aroma, which you'll get to know much better very soon. For now, you just stand there, on the rickety porch, a few feet from the entrance. The tinny piano music is clear, a repetitive, almost frantic little tune that seems to have no beginning and no end. You can distinguish individual voices now in the low rumble of conversation, but not the words. It is a human sound, and yet it feels alien. you've journeyed from the vast, silent emptiness of the plains to this one pinpoint of chaotic life. The building is shabby, the sign is a joke, and the whole setup feels deeply temporary. Yet, this is the center of the universe for every soul inside. You take a deep breath, steeling yourself, and reach for the doors, and here they are, the most iconic entryway in cinematic history. The swinging doors. In your mind, they are waist-high, dark stained wood, and pushing them open is an act of supreme confidence, a statement of arrival. The ones in front of you are a little less impressive. They are made of the same cheap, unpainted pine as the rest of the building, and they only come up to about your mid-thigh. They are often called batwing doors, or sometimes cafe doors, and their purpose isn't nearly as romantic as Hollywood would have you believe. You place a hand on the right side door. The wood is rough and gritty with a layer of fine dust. You give it a push. Instead of a satisfying THWU, MPTHWUMP, the door lets out a pain, high-pitched squeak from its leather hinge as it swings inward. For a brief second, you've opened a portal. The first thing that hits you is the heat. It is a dense, suffocating wave of warmth, laden with the smells of tightly packed, unwashed humanity. It is a physical presence, a stark contrast to the cool, clean air of the prairie night you just left behind. Immediately following the heat is a wall of sound. The vague, muffled hum you heard outside explodes into a full-blown cacophony. It is a chaotic symphony of dozens of conversations happening at once, a constant, roaring babble of English mixed with German, Spanish, and languages you don't even recognize. Above it all, you hear the sharp clack of glass hitting wood, the occasional burst of loud, barking laughter that sounds more desperate than joyful, and the relentless, tinny plinking of that piano, which is somehow even more jarring up close. You step through, and the doors squeak shut behind you, cutting off your retreat. Your eyes, accustomed to the darkness, struggle to adjust to the dim, hazy light. The air is thick with smoke, not the pleasant, aromatic smoke of a fine cigar, but the harsh, acrid smoke of cheap, hand-rolled cigarettes and foul-smelling stogies. The light comes from a few kerosene lamps hanging from the ceiling beams, their glass chimneys coated in a black film of soot, casting a greasy, flickering yellow glow over everything. The smoke catches this light, swirling invisible currents through the air, making it hard to see the far end of the room clearly. Let us talk about these doors for a second. Their design was purely practical, and frankly, a bit of a letdown if you were expecting drama. The short stature was intentional. It allowed for air circulation, a crucial feature in a room this crowded and smoky, while still offering a modicum of privacy from the street. It blocked the worst of the dust that constantly blew down the unpaved roads, and it kept strayed hogs and other animals from wandering in. It also meant a lawman standing outside could peer over the top to see what was happening, and a bartender could look out to see who was coming. Most importantly, it announced that the establishment was open for business without leaving a gaping hole in the front of the building. So no, they weren't designed for a hero to make a grand entrance. They were designed to let the stink out and keep the dust from getting in. Now that you're inside, you pause, letting your back rest against the rough wall near the entrance, trying to become invisible. No one pays you much attention. A few heads might have turned when the door squeaked. A brief, disinterested glance, but they've already returned to their drinks, their cards, their arguments. You are not important here. You are just another body seeking something. A drink, a game, a moment of oblivion. The room is long and narrow. To your left, a massive bar runs almost the full length of the space. It is made of a single, long slab of dark wood, though it is hard to tell its original color under the layers of grime and spilled liquor that give it a perpetually sticky sheen. Behind it stands a figure you will all get to know better soon. Along the opposite wall are a few small, rickety tables, each surrounded by a cluster of men hunched over cards or dice. At the far end of the room is the source of the music. A man in a bowler hat slumped over an upright piano, his fingers moving with a kind of weary muscle memory. Historians and architectural enthusiasts still have little debates about the origin of these specific doors. Were they a truly American invention? a piece of vernacular architecture born out of the specific needs of the frontier. Or were they, as the name café or suggests, simply an adaptation of a style seen in European establishments, brought over and simplified for the rough-and-tumble West? The consensus generally leans towards a practical, on-the-spot evolution, but the idea that this quintessential symbol of the West might just be a hand-me-down from a Parisian coffee house is a wonderfully deflating thought. Standing here, in the overwhelming noise and haze, you suspect no one in this room has ever given it a moment's thought. The doors work. That is all that matters. You take a deep breath, or rather, you try to, but instead of oxygen, your lungs fill with the signature perfume of the Wild West Saloon, and it is an assault on the senses. Let us break down this complex bouquet, shall we? The most dominant note, the one that hits you first, is the sharp, cloying smell of cheap alcohol. It's not the oaky, caramelized scent of a well-aged whiskey. No, this is the raw, pungent stench of industrial-grade ethanol, the kind of stuff that stings your nostrils and makes your eyes water. It has the smell of spills that have soaked into the wooden floorboards for years, of glasses that are never quite clean, and of the breath of every man in the room. Beneath that overpowering alcoholic top note, there is a thick, heavy base layer, and washed bodies. You have to remember, this is an era before daily showers on defective deodorant. The men in this room are miners, cattle drivers, prospectors, and laborers. They've been working for weeks, maybe months, under the hot sun, caked in dirt, grime, and sweat. The concept of regular bathing was a luxury, often involving heating water over a fire and using a small tin tub. For most, a quick splash of water on the face was the extent of their daily hygiene, so you lay smelling the accumulated evidence of hard labor. A musky, sour tang that clings to their rough-spun clothes and fills the enclosed space. Now, layer on top of that the acrid smoke we've already mentioned. It is a mix of cheap cigars, which smelled more like burning garbage than tobacco, and hand-rolled cigarettes made with harsh, dry leaf. The smoke stings your throat and creates a permanent haze, but it also does a half-hearted job of masking the other, more unpleasant smells. It is like spraying cheap air freshener in a locker room. It doesn't eliminate the odor. It just adds another layer to the olfactory mess. And then there's the floor. You glance down. The floorboards are dark and stained, but they are covered in a layer of something that looks like fresh sawdust. This was a common and surprisingly clever practice. The sawdust was there to absorb spills, whether it was beer, whiskey, or tobacco spit. It made cleaning up, in theory, a bit easier at the end of the night, or more likely, the end of the week. The soiled sawdust would be swept up and replaced. It was the 19th century equivalent of putting down newspaper for a puppy. A bizarre little fact. In some of the more upscale saloons, the sawdust might be scented with something like cedar or sarsaparilla oil to try and combat the stench. But here, in the Prairie Rose, it is just plain, dusty sawdust, and it is already doing a poor job. It is clumping in dark, damp patches, and it is starting to smell like a hamster cage that desperately needs cleaning. The mixture is almost dizzying. Alcohol, sweat, smoke, and damp, dirty wood. You might even catch a faint, metallic whiff of blood from a recent scuffle, or the underlying smell of kerosene from the lamps. It is the smell of a place that is never truly aired out, never truly clean. It is the smell of 100 stories of hope and failure, all fermenting together in a single, poorly ventilated room. The very notion of what constituted a clean space in the 19th century is, of course, radically different from our own. The germ theory of disease was still a new and not universally accepted idea. Many people genuinely believed that bad smells, or miasmas, were what caused illness, which is why things like scented sawdust were used. They were fighting the smell, not the underlying bacteria. Historians are still piecing together the day-to-day realities of sanitation on the frontier, and it is a grim picture. There were no health codes, no inspections. A saloon was as clean as its owner decided it needed to be. And for most, clean enough to keep customers from leaving was the only standard that mattered. There's an ongoing debate about how aware people were of the health risks. Were they simply ignorant of the dangers of filth? Or were they so beaten down by the harshness of their lives that they were just resigned to it? Looking around this room, at the weary faces and the grime on every surface, it feels like a bit of both. You decide the only way to survive this sensory onslaught is to get a drink of your own, to become a part of the system rather than an observer. You start to edge your way through the crowd, towards that long, sticky bar, trying not to brush up against anyone. The floor is sticky under your boots, and with every step, you kick up a little puff of that stale, multi-purpose soda. You finally reach the bar, finding a small gap between a burly man in a dusty duster coat and a weary prospector whose beard seems to contain remnants of his last 3 meals. You slide into the space, planting your elbows on the sticky wood to claim your territory, and there, on the other side of the counter, is the most powerful man in the room. He is not the biggest, nor the loudest, but he is the undeniable center of this chaotic universe. The bartender. Forget the cheerful, chatty confidant from television's sitcoms. This man is something else entirely. He is in his 40s, with a thick, drooping mustache that mostly hides his mouth. His hair is slicked back with some kind of grease, and he is wearing a shirt that might have once been white, with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing thick, sinewy forearms. His apron, tied around his waist, is a Paul Agasque masterpiece of stains. A historical record of every drink spilled and every scuffle mopped up, but it is his eyes that you notice. They are flat, tired, and miss absolutely nothing. He moves with an efficient, almost robotic grace, sliding a dirty glass under a tap, wiping the counter with a rag that looks like it could stand up on its own, and collecting coins without ever seeming to look directly at the person paying. He is the gatekeeper. He decides who gets a drink, who has had too much, and who needs to be unceremoniously ejected into the street. He is the bouncer, the banker, and often the only sober person in the establishment. His job is a delicate balancing act. He needs to encourage patrons to drink as much as possible to maximize profit, but he also needs to prevent the inevitable chaos from escalating to the point where it destroys the furniture or scares off the other paying customers. It is a tightrope walk he performs every single night. You watch him for a moment. He breaks up a nascent argument between 2 minors with a single, low-voiced command that cuts through the din like a knife. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. His authority is absolute. A moment later, he slides a brimming mug of beer down the bar with practiced ease, stopping it perfectly in front of a waiting customer. He is the conductor of this orchestra of dysfunction. A fascinating and often overlooked aspect of the frontier bartender was his role as a source of information. In a world without telephones or daily newspapers, the bartender was the local news hub. He heard all the gossip, knew who had just struck it rich and who was on a losing streak. He knew which land claims were promising and which were worthless. Travelers and newcomers would often talk to the bartender first to get the lay of the land. This, of course, also made him a prime target for conmen and swindlers who would try to pump him for information about potential marks. A good bartender learned to be a master of discretion, listening more than he spoke. His workstation is a marvel of crude efficiency. Behind him is the famous back bar, which in fancier places would be a massive, ornate mirror imported from Street, Louis, or even Europe. Here, it is just a set of rough wooden shelves holding a motley collection of unlabeled bottles and a few stacks of thick, cloudy glasses. Below the counter, out of your sight, is where he keeps the essentials. There's probably a bung starter for opening barrels, a collection of rags, and very likely a sawed-off shotgun or a heavy club. The tools of his trade for when verbal authority isn't enough. The actual role and social standing of a bartender is something academic circles still touch upon. Was he seen as a respectable businessman, a purveyor of a necessary social service in a lonely world, or was he viewed as a parasite, profiting from the misery and addiction of others? The answer, like most things in the West, is complicated and likely depended on who you asked. To the town drunk, he was a savior, To the temperance union ladies who were beginning to organize back east, he was the devil incarnate. Historical documents show both views. You find newspaper articles praising certain saloon owners as pillars of their community, and you find diaries and letters condemning them as the source of all the town's problems. He finally turns his flat gaze to you. He doesn't speak. He just raises his eyebrows slightly. A silent, impatient what'll it be? The pressure is on. You've made it through the door. You breathe the air. And now you have to prove you belong. You have to order a drink. And in this place, what you order says a lot about you. You clear your throat, trying to sound more confident than you feel. Whiskey, you manage to say, your voice sounding small in the surrounding din. It seems like the classic. Safe choice. The bartender gives a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He turns, grabs a glass from a murky tub of water that he laughably calls a rinse, and places it on the bar in front of you with a wet thud. The glass is thick, heavy, and has a faint greasy film on it. He then reaches for an unlabeled brown bottle from the shelf behind him and pours a small amount of amber liquid into your glass. He slides it towards you. 2 bits. He grunts, his eyes already scanning the rest of the room. You slide the coins across the sticky bar, and he scoops them up without a word, dropping them into a wooden drawer. Now it is just you and your drink. You look down at the so-called whiskey. The color seems a little off, a little too yellow, a little too uniform. There are no legs clinging to the side of the glass when you swirl it. It just looks like colored water. You raise the glass to your nose, and the smell confirms your suspicions. There is a faint hint of something that might be grain, but it's completely overwhelmed by the raw, chemical burn of cheap alcohol and the strange, sweet, almost medicinal odor. You take a sip. It is a mistake. The liquid hits your tongue like a spark, a fiery, aggressive burn that has none of the complexity or smoothness of actual whiskey. It tastes of raw ethanol with an acrid, bitter finish. You can feel the warmth spreading down your esophagus, the harsh, unpleasant heat. You suppress a cough. This is not the drink of cowboys and heroes. This is poison, and in a very literal sense, it often was. The whiskey served in the average frontier saloon was a vile concoction, a masterpiece of dangerous chemistry. A real, barrel-aged whiskey from Kentucky or Pennsylvania was an expensive luxury, far too costly to be shipped in large quantities to remote boomtowns. So, enterprising saloon owners created their own. They would start with a barrel of cheap, neutral grain spirit, basically pure, unaged alcohol. Then, the art began. To give it color, they'd add burnt sugar or a dash of tobacco juice. To give it a bit of bite and mimic the flavor of aging, they might add anything from chili powder and ginger to strychnine or rattlesnake heads. Yes, you heard that right. Rattlesnake heads were sometimes thrown into the barrel, with the belief that their venom would add a certain potency. This brew was often given colorful, dramatic names like tarantula juice, tough and varnish, red eye, or log lifter. One popular name was 40-rod whiskey, so named because it was said you couldn't walk more than 40 rods, about 200 meters, after drinking it before you collapsed. This brings us to a wonderfully bizarre and grim little piece of saloon history. The whiskey drummer. These weren't musicians. They were traveling salesmen who specialized in selling saloon keepers not whiskey, but the additives to make whiskey. They would arrive in town with a case full of little bottles and powders, essences of rye, bourbon flavor, artificial aging agents, and colorants. They'd sell the saloon owner a barrel of cheap alcohol and a recipe book for turning it into various spirits. It was a fraud on a massive scale, an entire industry built on creating counterfeit booze. The exact recipes and the prevalence of the most dangerous additives are, unsurprisingly, a subject of some historical debate. Accounts from the period are full of sensational stories about what went into this firewater, but it can be hard to separate fact from tall tale and temperance movement propaganda. Did bartenders really use gunpowder and acid? Some almost certainly did, either out of ignorance or pure, cynical greed. Historians often look at records of sickness and death in these towns, which show high rates of alcohol poisoning and other ailments that could be linked to consuming this toxic swill. While the most extreme stories of rattlesnake heads might be exaggerated, there is no doubt that the average glass of saloon whiskey was, at best, a fraud, and at worst, a serious health hazard. You take another, much smaller sip, trying to acclimate yourself to the taste. It doesn't get any better, but you notice something. The harsh burn is followed by a quick, dulling effect. The noise of the room seems to recede slightly. The smells become a little less pungent. The edges of your anxiety begin to soften, and in that moment, you understand. People didn't drink this stuff because it was good. They drank it because it was cheap, and because it worked. It was a potent, fast-acting anesthetic for the pain of a hard life on the frontier. You are not drinking a beverage. You are consuming a tool. A crude, dangerous tool, but a tool nonetheless. You hold the thick, greasy glass in your hand and stare into the amber liquid, feeling a little more like a part of the desperate, buzzing room around you. As the chemical warmth of the whiskey spreads through your veins, you start to tune back into the sounds of the room. Above the constant drone of voices, one sound persists: the piano. You turn your attention to the far corner of the saloon, where the instrument and its player are tucked away, almost as an afterthought. The piano itself is a tragic sight. It has an upright model, its dark wood veneer chipped and scarred. A network of rings from wet glasses and mugs permanently stains its top, and a long, dark burn mark on one side suggests a carelessly placed cigar from long ago. Several of the ivory keytops are missing, revealing the yellowed, naked wood beneath. It looks less like a musical instrument and more like a piece of furniture that has survived a natural disaster. These pianos, often called honky-tonk or tack pianos, are usually cheap, durable models shipped from back east. They were built to withstand abuse, not to produce beautiful music, and the man playing it is a perfect match for his instrument. He is slumped on a wobbly stool, a worn bowler hat tilted low over his eyes. He is not playing for an audience. He is playing for the room, for the building itself. His fingers, seemingly detached from his conscious mind, move across the keys with a mechanical, wary precision. The music they produce isn't the jaunty, cheerful ragtime you hear in movies. It is repetitive, formulaic, and tinged with a deep, unshakable melancholy. He plays the same few chords over and over, a simple, thumping rhythm that serves as a kind of auditory wallpaper, a background hum that fills the silence between arguments and laughter. It is music designed not to be listened to, but to be heard without being noticed. This was the reality of the saloon piano player. He wasn't a celebrated artist. He was a low-wage laborer, often at the very bottom of the saloon's social hierarchy. His job was simply to provide noise, to keep a rhythm going that might encourage patrons to drink more and tap their feet. He was often paid a pittance, sometimes just in drinks and a place to sleep, perhaps on a cot in a back room or even on the floor after closing time. Many were itinerant musicians, drifting from one boomtown to the next, their skills just enough to secure them a temporary gig, before they drank their meager earnings and moved on. You notice that occasionally, a miter, flush with a few dollars, will stumble over to the piano and drop a coin into a tin cup resting on top. The pianist doesn't acknowledge him with a nod or a smile. The only change is that the tempo of his playing might increase slightly for a minute or two. A brief, frantic burst of energy, before settling back into its monotonous drone. It is a purely transcational relationship. Here's a small, curious detail about these saloon pianos. To get that classic honky-tonk sound, they were often intentionally modified. The piano player, or the saloon owner, might insert brass tacks into the felt hammers that strike the strings. This gave the notes a brighter, tinnier, a more percussive quality, which helped the sound cut through the noise of a crowded room. It was a crude form of amplification, so that distinctive sound we associate with the Wild West wasn't necessarily because the pianos were out of tune, though they often were. It was a deliberate choice to make them louder and more jangly. The very sound was a product of the harsh environment it was meant to inhabit. The true role and background of these musicians is another area where historical records are thin. And romanticism often fills the gaps. Were they all tragic? Failed concert pianists, drowning their sorrows in frontier dives? Almost certainly not. The majority were likely self-taught players with a limited repertoire of popular tunes and folk songs. However, the academic world does acknowledge that these players were crucial to the Saloon's atmosphere. They were the live soundtrack to the westward expansion. There is a debate about how much creative freedom they had. Did they subtly alter their music to match the mood of the room, playing something slower when things were calm, and faster when a fight was brewing? Or were they, as this man appears to be, simply human jukeboxes, playing on autopilot until their shift was over? You watch the piano player for another minute. He never looks up. His world seems to be confined to the 88 keys in front of him, many of them damaged. He is the ghost in this machine, providing a pulse for the room, but remaining completely disconnected from it. He's sad. Repetitive music is the perfect anthem for this place. It has the tune of tired momentum, of going through the motions because stopping is an even more terrifying prospect. It has the sound of a place where joy is manufactured, and hope is a commodity that's always in short supply. The sad little song keeps playing, a loop of weary notes for a room full of weary souls. Finishing the last of your startlingly effective whiskey, you feel anew, albeit chemically induced, confidence. You push away from the bar and let your gaze drift over to the tables scattered along the opposite wall. This is the second major hub of saloon life, the gambling den. Every table is a small island of intense, focused energy, a stark contrast to the loud, aimless milling of the drinkers at the bar. You focus on one table in particular. It is a round, wobbly affair, its surface scarred with knife marks and cigarette burns. 4 men are seated around it, their bodies hunched forward, their attention locked on the small pile of worn playing cards and coins in the center. The light from the nearest kerosene lamp casts deep shadows on their faces, highlighting the tension etched around their eyes and mouths. There is no witty banter here, no charming bravado. The only sounds are the soft rustle of cards being shuffled, the clink of a coin being tossed into the pot, and the occasional low, guttural curse from a man who has just been dealt a bad hand. These are not professional gamblers playing a high-stakes game of wits. These are the lifeblood of the frontier economy in its rawest form. One man is clearly a prospector, his face sunburnt to the color of old leather, his fingernails permanently outlined in black from his work. He has betting with a small deerskin pouch of gold dust, carefully pinching a bit out for each bet, his hand trembling slightly. Across from him is a young cowboy, barely out of his teens, his face a mask of desperate hope. He just got paid after a 3-month cattle drive, and you can see him mentally calculating how much of his hard-earned wages are already sitting in that pot. The third man is older, with the haunted, hollowed-out look of a man who has been on the losing end of too many games. He is down to his last few coins, and his posture is one of complete defeat, even as he stays in the game, chasing a win that will never come. The fourth man, he is different. He has dressed a little better, his hands are clean, and he has a calm, predatory stillness about him. He might be the house professional, or worse, a traveling card sharp who makes his living by finding tables just like this one. You are witnessing the dark side of the boomtown dream. These men came west chasing a fortune, in a gold pan, at the end of a cattle trail, or by laying railroad tracks. But the work was brutal, the rewards uncertain. The gambling table offered a seductive shortcut. Here, in the space of a single hand, you could double your stake, or lose everything you'd worked for months to earn. It was a microcosm of the frontier itself, a high-risk, high-reward environment where luck, skill, and deception were all hopelessly entangled. For most, it wasn't a form of entertainment. It was an act of sheer desperation. It was a second, more dangerous kind of prospecting, sifting through cards instead of riverbeds. A weirdly specific detail of saloon gambling was the quality of the cards themselves. Today, we are used to glossy, plastic-coated playing cards. Back then, cards were made of thick, uncoated paper stock. They became dirty and marked almost immediately. After just a few hours of play in a smoky, grimy saloon, the backs of the cards would be smudged, bent, and nicked, a scold cheek. known as a card mechanic, could learn to read the subtle marks on the back of the cards as easily as if they were face up. This is why a fresh deck was a frequent request. But in a place like this, fresh just meant a deck that was slightly less battered than the one currently in use. The very nature of gambling in these establishments is a point of contention for historians. Were saloons primarily social spaces where gambling was a secondary activity? Or were they fundamentally gambling houses that happened to serve liquor? The evidence suggests it varied wildly. Some saloons were relatively straight, with drinking as the main event. Others, particularly those in rougher mining camps, were little more than traps, designed from the ground up to fleece unsuspecting laborers of their pay. The term sucker was practically invented in these rooms. The debate often centers on how complicit the saloon owner was. Was he just providing the space for a popular pastime? Or was he actively in league with the professional sharps, taking a cut of their dishonest winnings? The prospector hesitantly pushes his entire pouch of gold dust into the center of the table. A collective intake of breath. The young cowboy stares at his cards, sweat beading on his forehead. He has to match the bet or fold. He looks from his cards to the dwindling pile of coins in front of him, the physical representation of 3 months of dust, sweat, and loneliness. You can see the war in his eyes. The rational part of his brain is screaming at him to walk away, to save what little he has left. But the insidious whisperer of the gamble, the siren song of what if, is too strong. With a shaky hand, he pushes all his remaining coins into the pot. The table is silent. The only sound is the sad, repetitive plinking of the piano from the corner, an indifferent soundtrack to his ruin. As you watch the drama unfold at that poker table, you might notice other, less familiar games being played in the room. While poker has become the definitive cinematic gambling game of the Old West, in the mid to late 19th century, it often took a back seat to a faster, simpler, and far more treacherous game. Zero. You wander over to a larger, specially designed table where a bigger crowd has gathered. The energy here is different. It's faster, more frantic. At the head of the table stands a dealer, a man with the same cold, watchful eyes as the bartender. In front of him is a layout, a board with spade symbols painted on it, representing the 13 card ranks from ace to king. To his right is a peculiar wooden device that looks like a small, open-fronted box. This is a faro box or shoe, and it's from this that the cards are dealt, one by one, face up. The rules are deceptively simple. Players place their bets on the layout, choosing which card rank they think will appear next. The dealer then pulls 2 cards from the box. The first card is the losing card. Anyone who bet on that rank loses their money to the house. The second card is the winning card. Anyone who bet on that rank gets paid even money. Then the dealer pulls 2 more cards, and the process repeats. It is fast, easy to understand, and utterly addictive. The crowd ebbs and flows with each turn of a card. Groans of frustration, sharp cries of victory. Money changes hands with dizzying speed. This game was so popular, it was often called the Tiger, and a common phrase for playing was bucking the tiger. The nickname's origin is a bit obscure, but it likely came from the early card backs that featured a drawing of a Bengal tiger. Going to buck the tiger meant you were going to try your luck against a beautiful, but ferocious and unpredictable beast, and more often than not, the tiger won. Faro was, by its very nature, a game that heavily favored the house, but it was also notoriously easy to cheat. The dealer, with a little sleight of hand, could manipulate the cards as he placed them in the dealing box. The box itself could be rigged, with hidden springs or clamps that allowed the dealer to see or control which card came out next. A common trick was the gafty box, where a tiny, almost invisible needle could be used to snag a specific card and hold it back. Players knew the games were often crooked, but the speed and the tantalizing possibility of a quick win kept them coming back. It was a symbiotic relationship of greed and hope. A wonderfully nerdy bit of trivia for you. The lexicon of the Old West is littered with terms that originated at the faro table. The expression to break even comes from faro, When a player bet on a card and both the winning and losing cards of a turn were the same rate, a split, the house took half the bet. Players hated this rule. The phrase in hawk, meaning imta, is also believed to have come from the pharaoh layout. The hawk was the last card left in the dealing box at the end of a round. Its fate was uncertain, much like someone who was deeply in debt. And keeping track of your bets, well, that's where we get the phrase keeping tabs. Players would use little counters, or tabs, to track their wagers. Why was Pharaoh so popular? And why did it eventually fade away, to be replaced by poker? This is a question that fascinates gambling historians. One theory is that Pharaoh's decline was precisely because it was so easy to cheat. As players became more savvy and distrustful, they began to prefer games like poker, where all the cards were held by the players themselves. Poker felt more like a game of skill and psychology, whereas Pharaoh was increasingly seen as a blatant swindle. The house always had an edge, but in Pharaoh, that edge could be turned into an insurmountable and invisible wall of deceit. The academic debate continues on whether Pharaoh was a net negative or a strange, necessary part of the frontier economy. Some argue it was a predatory machine that drained wealth from the working class and funneled it into the hands of saloon owners and professional gamblers. Others take a more nuanced view, suggesting it was a form of entertainment tax, a voluntary contribution made by laborers for the thrill and the social experience. They argue that, for many, the act of bucking the tiger was worth the price of admission, even if they almost always went home with empty pockets. You watch the Pharaoh dealer. His face is a blank mask, his hands moving with the smooth, economical motions of a factory worker on an assembly line. He pulls a card, a groan from the left side of the table. He pulls another, a cheer from the right. He rakes in the losing bets and pays out the winning ones. Here's a relentless, hypnotic rhythm. Win, lose, win, lose. For every cheer, there is a groan. For every winner, there are 3 losers. The tiger, it seems, is having a very good night. You turn your attention back to the poker game, where the tension has finally broken. The young cowboy, having pushed his entire worldly wealth into the pot, has just lost. The better-dressed man, the one who seemed so calm, rakes in the pile of coins in the prospector's pouch of gold dust with a practiced, almost dismissive motion. He doesn't smile. He doesn't gloat. He simply stacks the coins neatly in front of him. For him, it is just another day at the office. The young cowboy stares at the empty space on the table where his money used to be. His face is pale. His expressions lack with shock. The flush of adrenaline has faded, leaving behind the cold, bitter residue of reality. 3 months of work, gone in 3 minutes. He slowly pushes his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floorboards. For a moment, you think he might explode in anger, flip the table, or draw a weapon. This is the moment in the movies where the fight breaks out, but he doesn't. He just stands up, sways slightly, and then turns and walks towards the door, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter and complete defeat. No one says a word. No one looks at him. His ruin is his own private affair. This is the reality behind the romantic notion of the poker face. We think of it as a tool of the master strategist, a cool, calculated mask worn to deceive opponents and hide the strength of a great hand. And sometimes it was, but far more often, especially for the amateurs who made up the bulk of saloon clientele, the poker face was not a mask of confidence. It was a mask of terror. It was the desperate, strained attempt to hide the fact that you were betting the money you needed to feed your family, to buy supplies, or to get a ticket back home. It was the face of a man trying to project an image of casual indifference while his stomach was twisted in knots of pure, gut-wrenching anxiety. The pressure was immense. In the tight-knit, hyper-masculine society of the frontier, showing weakness was a cardinal sin. You couldn't be seen to be afraid. You couldn't let the other players know that the bet you just made represented your last dollar. So you had to sit there, stone-faced, while your heart hammered against your ribs. The poker face wasn't about hiding a royal flush. It was about hiding your desperation. It was a performance, and the stakes weren't just the money on the table. but your reputation and your standing among the other men in the room. A curious little tidbit about the psychology of the game. One of the most feared players in a saloon wasn't necessarily the best card player. It was the man who had nothing to lose. A man who was already broke, playing with borrowed money, or who was simply drunk and reckless, was terrifyingly unpredictable. He didn't care about the odds. He bet everything on a terrible hand just to see what would happen. He couldn't be bluffed or intimidated. This kind of player could throw the entire dynamic of a table into chaos, often leading to huge, unexpected losses for the more sensible players. The true wild card at the table was often the man, not the piece of cardboard. The historical interpretation of the poker face has evolved over time. Early accounts often portrayed in that heroic, stoic light, the cool-headed lawman or the unflappable gambler. But more recent social historians have begun to re-examine it through the lens of social psychology and trauma. They argue that for many men, particularly veterans of the Civil War, this kind of emotional suppression was a learned survival mechanism, the same blank, detached expression that got them through the horrors of a battlefield was redeployed at the poker table. The debate then becomes, was the poker face a strategic tool of the game, or was it a symptom of a much deeper, more pervasive emotional trauma that haunted the men of the West? Was it a game face, or a trauma response? You watch the professional gambler who won the pot. His face is still unreadable, but you see it differently now. Is he a master of deception, or is he just as trapped as everyone else? His office is this grimy, dangerous row. His clients are desperate, broken men. His salary is the money he strips from them. He finishes stacking his winnings and begins to shuffle the cards for the next hand. The prospector, having lost his gold, is gone. The defeated cowboy is gone. The new hopefuls, drawn in by the magnetic pull of the game, are already sliding into the empty chairs. The game doesn't stop. It never stops. The faces change, but the desperation remains the same. The poker faces are put back on, and a new hand is dealt. Your gaze drifts away from the grim theater of the gambling tables and scans the rest of the room. And then you see them. They are impossible to miss. A splash of bright, if somewhat faded, color in a sea of dusty brown and gray, clustered near the end of the bar. And occasional, circulating among the tables, are the saloon girls. The Hollywood image is burned into our collective memory. A beautiful, witty woman in a lavish satin dress, with a heart of golden to sharp tongue. She is a dancer, a singer, a confidant to the hero, maybe even the owner of the saloon herself. She is independent, respected, and in control of her own destiny. Now, look at the women actually in this room. The reality is a much sadder, more complicated picture. There are maybe 3 or 4 of them. Their dresses, which might have been vibrant, red, or blue once, are now frayed at the hems and stained with spilled drinks. The lace on their bodices is torn. The ribbons in their hair are limp. Their faces are painted with a thick, crude layer of makeup, a desperate attempt to feign youth and health under the harsh, unforgiving kerosene light. It doesn't quite work. In the flickering gloom, you can see the exhaustion in their eyes, the faint lines of hardship around their mouths. These women were known by many names: saloon girls, dance hall girls, hurdy-gurdy girls, or, more bluntly, percentage girls. They were not, for the most part, glamorous entertainers. They were employees, and their job was simple and exploitative. They were there to persuade the male patrons to buy more drinks. When a man bought a drink for one of these girls, she would often be served a small glass of colored sugar water or weak tea, while the man was charged the full, inflated price of a real whiskey. The girl would then receive a commission, a percentage of the sale, which is where that name comes from. The rest of the profit went directly to the saloon owner. Their job was to be companions for hire. They would sit with a lonely miner, laugh at his stories, let him buy them drinks, and maybe dance with him. The dance itself was often a clumsy, shuffling affair in a small, crowded space, not the elegant waltzes seen in films. It was all a transaction, a way to separate a man from his money by offering a fleeting illusion of female companionship in a world where women were scarce. A little known and rather depressing fact is that many of these women were effectively indentured servants. A saloon owner might pay for a young woman's train ticket from a city back east, promising a glamorous job as a singer or dancer. When she arrived, she would be told that she had to work off the cost of her transportation, her lodging in a tiny room above the saloon, and her food, with inflated prices for everything. She quickly found herself in a debt she could never hope to repay. She was trapped, a prisoner of the saloon's ledger book. The social and legal status of these women is a topic of intense and sometimes contentious historical debate. The line between saloon girl and outright prostitute was often blurry, and in many cases, non-existent. Some women worked strictly on a percentage basis, selling only drinks and conversation. Others were expected by the saloon owner, or forced by their desperate circumstances, to offer more intimate services in the small rooms or cribs, upstairs or out back. Historians still argue about the degree of agency these women had. Were they all tragic, exploited victims, or were some of them savvy entrepreneurs who understood the harsh rules of the frontier and chose this life as a better alternative to the drudgery of being a laundress or a seamstress, two of the other main occupations available to women? The truth is likely that it was a spectrum. For every woman who was trapped and victimized, there might have been another who navigated this dangerous world with a degree of cunning and control. But even for the most successful, it was a life lived on a knife's edge. You watch one of the girls approach a table of loud, boisterous cattle drivers. She forces a smile, her eyes looking tired. She says something, and one of the men laughs, grabbing her by the waist and pulling her onto his lap. She doesn't resist, her smile becoming a fixed, painted-on mask. Another man signals to the bartender for another round of drinks. The system is working perfectly. The girl is doing her job. The men are spending their money. The saloon owner is getting rich. And you, watching from the bar, are seeing the romantic myth of the saloon girl dissolve into the much grimmer reality of a woman simply trying to survive another night. You see the man who pulled the saloon girl onto his lap hand her a coin. She tucks it away quickly, then slides off his lap as he turns his attention back to his friends. Her smile vanishes the moment his back is turned. She just sold him a few moments of her time. A brief, physical interaction that means nothing to her but is a valuable commodity in this environment. Everything here has a price, and the economy of companionship is calculated down to the last penny. The most basic transaction was the dance. A man could purchase a dance with one of the girls for a set price, often paid in the form of a token or ticket that he bought from the bartender. A typical price might be $1 for a single dance, which was an exorbitant amount at a time when a laborer might only make $1 or $2 for a full day's work. The dance itself was usually short, lasting only as long as one of the piano player's repetitive tunes. At the end of the dance, the girl would lead the man to the bar to buy her a drink, adding to her commission. The drink prices were another part of the hustle. Aim and drinking alone might pay 25 cents for a whiskey, but if he was buying a drink for one of the girls, the price for both of their drinks might suddenly jump to 75 cents or $1. The girl, as you know, would receive her colored water, and the saloon owner would pocket the massive markup. This system was so common that these establishments were sometimes called the bit dance halls, not because the drinks were cheap, but because everything was priced in multiples of 2 bits, 25 cents. For the girls, it was a grueling numbers game. They had to sell as many dances and as many overpriced drinks as possible to make a living. An account from a period newspaper describes a dance hall girl's nightly routine, from the first drink in the evening to the last drink in the morning. Her life is a waltz with men in exchange for drinks and a miserable percentage. They were on their feet for hours, forcing conversation, fending off unwanted advances, and always smiling. The physical and emotional toll was immense. A strange and specific element of this world was the dance token. Instead of using cash for every single dance, some of the more organized or more predatory saloons would sell custom-made metal tokens. A man would buy, say, 10 tokens for $9, feeling like he got a deal. These tokens were often stamped with the saloon's name and a phrase like "good for one dance." This was a clever business trick for several reasons. First, it got the money from the customer's pocket up front. Second, men were more likely to spend a token than a real dollar bill. It felt less like spending money. And third, inevitably, men would end their night with a few unspent tokens in their pocket. They might lose them, or leave town and forget about them. Every unspent token was pure profit for the saloon owner. It was a 19th century version of a gift card. The historical debate around the economics of this percentage system is fascinating. Some economic historians argue that it was a surprisingly sophisticated, if exploitative, form of commission-based sales. They analyze it as a business model, looking at pricing strategies, profit margins, and labor management. They might point out that, in a purely economic sense, the saloon owner was incentivizing his employees to maximize sales. But social historians push back against this sterile view. They argue that to analyze it purely in economic terms is to ignore the profound human cost. They focus on the diaries, letters, and court records that tell a story of coercion, despair, and the commodification of human interaction. The debate hinges on whether you view these women as economic actors or as victims of a predatory system. As is often the case, the reality was a messy and tragic combination of both. You watch as another man, a lonely-looking farmer by his clothes, awkwardly asks one of the other girls to dance. She agrees with a practiced, weary enthusiasm. He buys the token. They shuffle around a small, clear patch of sawdust-covered floor for 2 minutes while the piano plays its tinny tune. The song ends. She leads him to the bar. He buys her a drink. She sips her tea. He downs his whiskey. The transaction is complete. He has paid for a fleeting moment of contact, a brief respite from his solitude. She has earned a few more cents towards her survival. It is a sad, clumsy, and deeply human exchange, repeated hundreds of times a night, in hundreds of saloons just like this one, all across the great, lonely expanse of the West. Your eyes follow the saloon girl after she finishes her transcational drink with the farmer. Instead of returning to the main throng, she glances around, catches the subtle nod of the bartender, and then begins to walk towards the back of the room. There, half hidden in the shadows, is a rickety wooden staircase. It leads up into the darkness of the second floor. As she places a foot on the first step, she gives a brief, almost imperceptible look back over her shoulder, a look of profound weariness, before disappearing into the gloom above. That staircase is a silent, ominous character in the saloon's story. It represents a clear demarcation line. Down here, on the main floor, there is a semblance of public life, of rules, however flimsy. The transactions are, on the surface, about drinks and dances, but the staircase leads to a different world, a private and far more dangerous one. It leads to the rooms upstairs. In the most respectable saloons, the upstairs might simply be lodging rooms for travelers, or the living quarters for the saloon owner and his family. But in a place like the Prairie Rose, and in countless others like it, the upstairs had a much more specific and sordid purpose. These were the rooms where the line between saloon girl and prostitute was erased completely. They were often tiny, cell-like spaces, sometimes called cribs, furnished with nothing more than a simple bed, a wash basin, and a bucket. This was the final, most profitable, and most dangerous stage of the saloon's business model. A man who had been plied with drink, encouraged by the flirtations of the girls, and emboldened by the chaotic atmosphere might be invited upstairs. The price for this service was, of course, far higher than for a dance or a drink. A significant portion, often half or more, went directly to the saloon owner. He was not just a publican. He was a landlord renting out rooms by the hour, and, in many cases, a pimp profiting directly from the exploitation of the women who worked for him. The physical separation of the floors was crucial. It maintained a thin veneer of deniability. The saloon owner could claim that what happened upstairs was a private matter between two consenting adults, and that he was merely renting a room. It allowed the public space of the saloon downstairs to maintain its function as a general gathering place for the men of the town. some of whom might have been uncomfortable with a more overt and integrated brothel. It was a careful piece of social and architectural hypocrisy. Here is a rather grim and specific detail about the layout of these places. In some larger theater-style saloons in bigger towns like Denver or San Francisco, the upstairs rooms would be arranged in a gallery or balcony overlooking the main floor. Each room would have a door and a window. The women would sit in the windows, framed like portraits, so that the men drinking below could look up, survey the offerings, and make their choice. It was the literal elevation of human beings into a marketplace display. The extent to which all saloons were involved in this trade is a major point of debate among historians. Traditional histories, often written in a more prudish era, tended to downplay or ignore this aspect of saloon life. Focusing on the gambling and drinking, they created a sanitized version of the West. More modern historians, using sources like arrest records, private diaries, and town plats that clearly mark out red light districts, have brought this hidden world to light. The debate now is not if this happened, but how widespread it was. Was the saloon-brothel combination the norm, or was it confined to the roughest and most lawless hell-on-wheels towns? Some scholars argue that virtually every saloon that employed women had an upstairs component, while others maintained that a distinction, however fine, existed between a dance hall and a true brothel. You look at that dark staircase again, you can't see what's up there, but you can imagine it. It is a place of hushed, hurried transactions, of desperation meeting opportunity. It's a place far removed from the myths of the West. There is no romance up there, no glamour. There is only the grim reality of survival. The piano downstairs continues its relentlessly cheerful tune, a stark and brutal contrast to the silent commerce taking place just a few feet above. The staircase stands as a quiet testament to the fact that, in the Wild West, everything and everyone was for sale, and the most valuable commodity of all was the illusion of choice. As your gaze sweeps back across the room, you start to notice the quiet ones. Not everyone here is loud, boisterous, or engaged in a frantic gamble. Tucked away at a small table in a corner, or standing alone at the far end of the bar, are men who seem to be wrapped in a bubble of silence. They nurse a single glass of whiskey for an hour, their eyes fixed on the middle distance, their faces impassive. They don't speak to anyone, and no one speaks to them. They are like ghosts haunting the edges of the chaos. Look closer at one of them, a man in his late 30s, with a gaunt face and a haunted look in his eyes that the cheap whiskey can't quite erase. He has a slight, persistent tremor in his hands. His clothes are worn, but they have the faint echo of a uniform about them, perhaps the cut of the jacket, or the way he holds his shoulders. These are the other casualties of the era, the forgotten men of the American West, the veterans of the Civil War. The war had ended only a decade or two prior, but its shadow loomed large over the nation. It had been a conflict of unprecedented brutality, the first truly industrial war. Men who had survived the horrors of Shiloh, Antietam, or Gettysburg were now trying to piece their lives back together in a world that had no framework for understanding what they had been through. There was no concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. There was no therapy, no support network. A soldier suffering from flashbacks, anxiety, and depression was often dismissed as being weak, melancholic, or just a drunk. So, many of them came west. They were seeking a new start, a place where they could escape the memories of the settled society that didn't understand them. They became prospectors, railroad workers, farmhands, or sometimes outlaws and lawmen. The frontier, with its vast, empty spaces, seemed to promise a kind of peace, but the ghosts of the war followed them. They found their way into saloons like this one, seeking a different kind of peace at the bottom of a glass. The loud, chaotic environment of the saloon could be a way to drown out the internal silence, while the alcohol provided a temporary numbness. Here's a chilling and often overlooked fact. Many of the most famous figures of the Wild West were deeply affected by the war. Wyatt Earp's brothers, Virgil and James, were both seriously wounded veterans, while Bill Hickok served as a spy and scout for the Union. Doc Holliday, though too ill with tuberculosis to fight, came from a prominent Southern family, deeply scarred by the conflict. The violence of the West wasn't born in a vacuum. For many of its participants, it was a continuation of, or a reaction to, the organized, industrial-scale violence they had already experienced. A quick-draw duel, while mostly a myth, pales in comparison to the memory of a cavalry charge or an artillery barrage. The historical understanding of the Civil War's impact on westward expansion is a field of ongoing study. Historians debate the precise numbers, but it's clear that a significant percentage of the male population in the West during this period were veterans. The question scholars grapple with is how this shared trauma shaped the culture of the frontier. Did it contribute to the high levels of violence, the heavy drinking, and the pervasive sense of fatalism? Some argue that the frontier acted as a safety valve, drawing away traumatized and potentially disruptive men from the more settled East. Others contend that it simply transplanted the violence and trauma to a new, less structured environment, where it festered, uninterrupted in new ways. Was the West a place of healing, or was it a vast, open-air asylum with no doctors? You look back at the silent veteran in the corner. He takes a slow sip of his drink. What does he see when he stares into the smoky haze of the room? Does he see the faces of his fellow patrons, or the faces of comrades who fell beside him on a battlefield 1,000 miles and a lifetime away? He is a man out of time and out of place, a living embodiment of a past that refuses to die. The saloon, for him, is not a place of entertainment or social connection. It is a refuge. It is a place to be alone in a crowd, a place where the noise outside can temporarily overwhelm the noise inside. He is one of the many quiet, invisible specters of the saloon, a reminder that the West was not just settled by people chasing a future, but also by people fleeing a past. Now that your eyes are attuned to the subtle currents of the room, you start to notice another type of patron, one who blends in almost too well. He is not a dusty prospector or a rowdy cowboy. He is not a haunted veteran or a desperate gambler. He is, for lack of a better word, a gentleman, or at least, he is trying very hard to look like one. You spot him near the faro table, not playing, but watching. He is dressed in a dark, well-fitted suit, a little worn perhaps, but clean. He wears a bowler hat instead of a dusty Stetson, and his boots are polished. He might have a silver-headed cane hooked over his arm. He sips his drink slowly, a picture of refined observation. He looks like a visiting investor from back east, a land speculator, or perhaps a successful merchant. He exudes an aura of quiet prosperity and intelligence that seems out of place in this grimy establishment. Don't be fooled. This man is one of the most dangerous predators in the entire frontier ecosystem. He is a confidence man, a grifter, a swindler. His clean suit is his camouflage, his polished manners his weapon. He is not here to drink or to gamble fairly. He is here to hunt. His prey is every man in this room who has $1 in his pocket and a head full of dreams. These men were masters of psychology. They would spend days, even weeks, in a town, patiently observing the social dynamics of the saloon. They'd listen to the gossip, identifying the men who had recently made a lucky strike at the mines, the cowboys fresh off the trail with months of pay, or the naive newcomers who had just arrived from the east with their life savings. Once a target, or mark, was selected, the con would begin. It was rarely a quick hustle. It was a carefully orchestrated piece of theater. The con man might strike up a seemingly innocent conversation, buying the market rate, sympathizing with his troubles, and praising his intelligence. He would build a rapport, a foundation of trust. Then, the hook would be set. He might speak of a sure thing, a secret investment opportunity, a map to a lost gold mine, shares in a new railroad company that didn't exist, or a patent on a revolutionary piece of farm equipment. The stories were elaborate, persuasive, and always tailored to the Mark's specific hopes and dreams. The goal was to get the Mark so excited about the prospect of immense, easy wealth that he would hand over his own cash without a second thought. A fantastic, and frankly, weirdly specific con from the era was the sawdust game. A con man would show a Mark a bag supposedly full of gold dust. He'd let the mark take a pinch to have it assayed, and it would prove to be real. Convinced, the mark would agree to buy the entire bag for a hefty sum in cash. The switch would then happen. The con man would, through sleight of hand, swap the bag of real gold for an identical-looking bag filled with brass filings or, literally, worthless sawdust. By the time the mark discovered the fraud, the well-dressed gentleman would be long gone, on a train to the next town and the next saloon. The legal and social response to these con men is a subject of historical interest. While they were criminals, they occupied a strange gray area. Many of their schemes were so clever that it was difficult to prove a crime had been committed. Was it illegal to sell a worthless man, or was it just a bad business deal? Law enforcement was often minimal, and a smooth-talking grifter could often talk his way out of trouble or simply bribe the local sheriff. Some historians argue that these con men were unnatural, if parasitic, part of the hyper-capitalistic, unregulated environment of the West. They were entrepreneurs of deceit, exploiting the same Gilded Age credulity that allowed railroad barons and stock market manipulators to build fortunes back east. The debate centers on whether they were seen as truly dangerous criminals or as a sort of rogue trickster figure, a subject of grudging admiration for their cleverness. The victims, of course, had a much clearer opinion. You watch the well-dressed man. He has found his target. It is a young man, fresh-faced and wide-eyed, who is nursing a parent looking overwhelmed by the sea. The con man approaches him with a warm, disarming smile. He extends a clean, manicured hand. The conversation begins. You are witnessing the start of a silent, bloodless hunt. There are no guns drawn, no fists thrown, but an act of violence is about to be committed all the same. It is a different kind of robbery, one that steals not just a man's money, but his trust and his hope, leaving him with nothing but the bitter taste of his own foolishness. The con man is the intellectual predator of the saloon, and in this environment, he is perfectly at home. You take another look around the room, trying to see it as a whole. The drinkers, the gamblers, the veterans, the girls, the predators, all these disparate lives, all these individual stories of hope and despair, are packed into this one small space. And the thing that unifies them, the great equalizer that blurs all the sharp edges, is the smoke that hangs in the air in a thick, permanent cloud, a greasy fog that coils around the kerosene lamps and settles on every surface. It has a physical presence in the room. You can feel it on your skin, a fine, gritty film. You can taste it on the back of your throat, a harsh, chemical bitterness that even the terrible whiskey can't wash away. It gets in your eyes, making them water and sting. Breathing feels like a conscious effort. This smoke comes from a variety of sources. The most common is the hand-rolled cigarette. Men would carry a pouch of cheap, dry tobacco, often Bull Durham or a similar brand, and a packet of rolling papers. The act of rolling a cigarette was a small, constant ritual, a moment of focused activity in the chaos. But the main contributor to the dense smog is the cigar, and these are not the premium, hand-rolled cigars of a gentleman's club. These are stogies, cheap, mass-produced cigars that were strong, foul-smelling, and sold for a penny or two apiece. They were often made from the scraps and leavings of the tobacco industry, and they burned with a harsh, acrid smoke that smelled more like burning leaves than fine tobacco. The smoke is more than just a physical irritant. It's a social and psychological tool. It creates a veil, a literal smokescreen that grants a strange kind of privacy in a crowded room. Hiding behind a thick cloud of your own making, your face is obscured, your expressions harder to read. The poker player can hide his tells. The lonely man can hide his sadness. The con man can hide his predatory gaze. In the swirling haze, everyone is a little more anonymous, a little more mysterious. The smoke smudges identities, making it easier for a failed farmer to feel like a king for a night, or for a man fleeing his past to believe he has actually disappeared. This brings us to a wonderfully mundane but essential feature of saloon life, the match. In an era before disposable lighters, lighting a cigar or a cigarette required a match, and saloon owners quickly realized they could use this to their advantage. They would have boxes of matches available for free at the bar. The small gesture of generosity kept patrons happy and, more importantly, kept them smoking and drinking. A fun little piece of historical trivia is the variety of matches available. There were safety matches that had to be struck on a specific surface on the box, but more common in the rough and tumble West were the strike anywhere matches. These, often called luciferase, had a head made of white phosphorus, a volatile chemical that could ignite with friction on almost any surface, a tabletop, a boot heel, or even a thumbnail. They were convenient, but also notoriously dangerous, prone to igniting accidentally in a pocket. The long-term health effects of constantly inhaling this thing, toxic smoke, were, of course, completely unknown and disregarded at the time. The concept of secondhand smoke as a danger would have been utterly alien. But historians and medical historians are now quite certain that the miner's cough or saloon lung that plagued so many frontier residents was a direct result of this environment. It was a combination of the silica dust from the mines and the constant, unfiltered tobacco smoke inhaled in their leisure hours. The debate among historians isn't whether it was harmful, but to what extent people made the connection. Did they understand that their coughing fits and shortness of breath were linked to the smoky rooms they spent their nights in? Or did they just accept it as a normal part of a hard life? Another ailment to be borne stoically, like bad weather or bad luck. You watch as a man at the bar finishes his drink, pulls out his tobacco pouch, and expertly rolls a cigarette with one hand. He reaches over, grabs a match from a small box on the counter, and strikes it on the underside of the bar top. It flares to life with a hiss and a puff of sulfurous smoke. He lights a cigarette, shakes the match out, and drops it onto the sawdust-covered floor, where it joins hundreds of others. He takes a long drag, and a thick plume of blue-gray smoke erupts from his lips, joining the permanent, swirling haze that fills the room. He leans back against the bar, hidden for a moment behind his own personal cloud, another anonymous figure in the great, smoky machine of the saloon. As you acclimate to the general grime and haze, your eyes start to pick out the smaller, more specific details of the saloon's interior design, or rather, the lack thereof. You notice, placed strategically around the room, several large, heavy, brass or iron containers. They are wide-mouthed, often with a weighted bottom to keep them from tipping over easily. These are spit anus, or as they were more elegantly called, cuspidores, and they are, without a doubt, the most disgusting objects in the room. Their purpose was simple, to be a target for men chewing tobacco. Chewing tobacco was immensely popular in the 19th century, arguably more so than smoking in many regions. It was a habit that cut across all social classes. A man would cut a chaw or a plug from a larger brick of pressed, sweetened tobacco leaf and tuck it into his cheek. This would, of course, produce a large amount of saliva, which had to be disposed of in a civilized setting. A gentleman would use a spittoon. In the saloon, it was a free-for-all. You watch a man playing cards. He pauses, leans his head to the side, and with a practiced, forceful motion, ejects a stream of brown liquid. It lands in the nearest spittoon with a loud whack. He doesn't even break eye contact with his cards. It's a completely natural, unconscious gesture for him. The problem is, for every man with good aim, there are 5 with bad aim. The floor around each spittoon is a dark, stained halo of misses. The sawdust in these areas is a sticky, brown-black sludge. The smell is a sharp, sour, fermented odor that manages to cut through even the thick miasma of smoking stale beer. The spittoon is the perfect symbol of the saloon's approach to hygiene, a token gesture towards cleanliness that, in practice, only concentrates the filth and makes it more visible. It asks an admission that a disgusting habit is taking place, and this is the best, most practical solution they can come up with. Cleaning them was one of the worst jobs in the establishment, usually relegated to the lowest-ranking employee, the slumber, who was also responsible for sweeping the floors and cleaning the outhouses. It involved emptying the vile contents and giving the container a cursory rinse, a task that surely required a strong stomach and a dulled sense of smell. Here's a bizarre and slightly nauseating piece of saloon trivia. The art of spitting Men would often pride themselves on their aim and distance. There are anecdotal accounts of informal competitions, of men trying to hit the spittoon from across the room. The sound of the spit hitting the brass or iron target was a common, accepted part of the saloon soundscape. Furthermore, some high-end spit nests were designed with features to reduce splashback or to muffle the sound. There were models with funnels, or with a thin layer of water or oil at the bottom. The one in this saloon, however, is the most basic model, a heavy pot, half filled with sawdust and a noxious slurry of tobacco, juice and who knows what else. The cultural significance of the spittoon has been a subject of some, admittedly niche, academic discussion. Was the ubiquity of the spittoon a sign of a society that, despite its rough edges, was at least trying to maintain some standards of public decorum? Or was it the opposite, a symbol of a culture so saturated in a foul habit that it had to invent special furniture to accommodate it? Social historians point out that the public health campaigns of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly the fight against tuberculosis, often focused specifically on the unsanitary nature of public spitting. The spittoon became a symbol of a bygone, less agony carol. The debate, in a sense, is whether the spittoon represents a step toward civilization or the very definition of barbarism. You look away from the spittoon, your stomach turning slightly. It is a small detail in the grand, chaotic painting of the room, but it speaks volumes. It is a testament to the fact that the romance of the Wild West completely ignores the mundane reality of the human body and its less than romantic functions. The heroes of the movies never seem to need to spit, or sweat, or deal with the grime of everyday life. But here, in the real Prairie Rose Saloon, the evidence is everywhere. It's in the smell of unwashed bodies, in the sticky film on the bar, and it's coalescing in a foul-smelling brass pot in the corner of the room. It is a potent reminder that this place, for all its myth, is resolutely, stubbornly, and disgustingly human. The low, rumbling drone of the saloon, which has been the constant soundtrack to your evening, is suddenly pierced by a new sound. It is a raised voice, sharp and angry, coming from a group of men standing near the bar. You call him me at she. The voice is slurred, thick with cheap whiskey and misplaced pride. The murmur of the room doesn't stop, but it falters. The rhythm is broken. Heads turn. The piano player, sensing the shift in atmosphere, continues his tune, but it sounds a little more frantic now, a little more strained. The accusation hangs in the smoky air. It is directed at a wary trapper who had been playing a simple game of dice with a larger DC railroad worker. The trapper, looking nervous, holds his hands up. I said nothing of the sort. I just said you've had a lucky run. A lucky run. The big man dolors, taking a clumsy step forward. He knocks over a stool, which clatters to the floor. Are you saying my luck ain't honest? This is how it starts. Not with a dramatic, slow-motion standoff, but with a stupid, drunken misunderstanding. The argument is nonsensical. The accusation is vague. But in this environment, fueled by alcohol and a rigid, fragile code of honor, even the smallest perceived slight can detonate with explosive force. Pride is one of the few things these men feel they have left, and they will defend it with a ferocity that is completely out of proportion to the offense. The bartender, who has seen this exact scene play out 1,000 times, lets out a weary sigh. He places a hand on the counter, his knuckles white. He is not reaching for a weapon yet, but he is ready. He watches, his face a mask of bored calculation, trying to gauge if this is a fire that will burn itself out, or one that he'll have to put out himself. You watch, frozen in place like everyone else. The tension is a physical thing, a tightening in your chest. The railroad worker pokes a thick finger into the trapper's chest. The trapper swats it away. The railroad worker shoves him. The trapper stumbles back, knocking into another table. Aim and S drink spills. Now he is angry. 2. The conflict is spreading. A social contagion. A punch is thrown, clumsy and wild. It misses its intended target and connects with the shoulder of a bystander. And just like that, the fuse is lit. This is the true nature of violence in the Wild West. It was rarely the elegant, ritualized duel at high noon that movies love to portray. It was messy, chaotic, and often pathetic. It was a brawl, not a gunfight. Fists, boots, broken bottles, and heavy wooden chairs were the weapons of choice. It was fueled by alcohol and testosterone, and it erupted with little warning and for the dumbest of reasons. A spilled drink, a disputed card game, an imagined insult, a rivalry over one of the saloon girls. Any of these could be the spark. A weirdly specific and rather sad fact about these brawls is that they were often a form of social release for men living under immense pressure, with no healthy outlets for their frustration and anxiety. A physical fight could be a kind of catharsis. It was a way to let off steam, to feel something, to assert a sense of power in a life that was oft unpowerless. Of course, this therapy often resulted in broken teeth, black eyes, and sometimes, much worse. The historical debate around the level of violence in the West is one of the most famous in American historiography for a long time. The Hollywood version of a hyper-violent frontier was accepted as fact. Then, in the mid-20th century, a wave of revisionist historians came along. They looked at court records and census data from famous cattle towns like Dodge City and Abilene and argued that, statistically, these places were no more violent than big eastern cities like New York or Boston. They claimed the image of the Wild West was a myth, greatly exaggerated by sensationalist dime novels and newspapers. Now, the pendulum is swinging back towards a middle ground, where the constant, epic gunfights were a myth. Historians are reevaluating what violence means. They argue that focusing only on the homicide rate misses the point. The threat of violence was ever present. The culture was saturated with it. The brawls, the intimidation, the constant state of low-level conflict created an environment of fear and instability, even if it didn't always end in a body being carried out to Boot Hill. The debate is no longer about the number of deaths, but about the pervasive culture of aggression that the saloon both fostered and catered to. The shove has escalated into a full-blown melee. Two men are wrestling on the floor, rolling through the sawdust and spit. Another is trying to swing a chair in the crowded space. The bartender is now shouting, his voice a low roar that finally cuts through the din. The chaotic dance of clumsy violence has begun, and in a room this small, there is nowhere to hide. The brawl is now a swirling vortex of chaos in the center of the room. A table has been overturned, sending cards and coins scattering across the filthy floor. You press yourself back against the wall, trying to make yourself as small as possible. This is not the choreographed ballet of a movie bar fight, where stuntmen fly through breakaway windows and land on padded surfaces. This is ugly, clumsy, and frighteningly real. A man gets hit in the face, not with a clean movie punch, but with the back of a head as someone else falls backward. There is a sickening crunch of cartilage. Another man slips on a puddle of spilled beer and goes down hard, his head hitting the floor with a dull thud. The sounds are not heroic. They are the wet, pathetic sounds of bodies hitting things and each other. And what about the guns? In your mind, a saloon brawl inevitably escalates to a gunfight. Someone gets thrown through the batwing doors, stands up, and calls the other man out into the street. The piano player dives for cover. The patrons all flee. But that is not what is happening here. The men are using their fists, their boots, and a broken chair leg. Not one person has drawn a pistol. This is perhaps the biggest and most persistent myth of the Wild West. The duel, the idea of two men facing each other at a pre-arranged time and place, drawing their weapons on a signal in a test of speed and skill, is almost entirely a creation of fiction. It happened, but it was extraordinarily rare. The reality of gun violence was much more like the brawl you're witnessing. Sudden, chaotic, and almost always at close range. More importantly, it was considered deeply dishonorable and foolish. Why? Because the guns of the era were notoriously inaccurate. A cold peacemaker, the iconic gun that won the West, was a powerful weapon, but hitting a man-sized target from 20 paces under the stress of a duel was a feat for only the most expert of shots. Most men on the frontier, despite owning a gun, were not expert shots. They were farmers, miners, and cowboys, not trained gunslingers. To agree to a formal duel was essentially to agree to a game of chance where both participants were likely to get hurt or killed. The real gunfights of the West were ambushes and up-close and personal affairs. A man was far more likely to be shot in the back or shot from across a poker table than in a fair fight on Main Street. The famous gunfight at the Hotel Corral, for instance, wasn't a duel. It was a close-quarters, chaotic shootout in a narrow lot, with men standing only a few feet from each other. A truly quirky detail that illustrates this point is the belly gun. This was a type of small, large-caliber pistol, often with its barrel sawed off and sometimes even with the trigger guard removed for a quicker draw from a pocket. It was designed for one purpose, to be used at point-blank range, literally pressed against an opponent's belly in the middle of a struggle. It was an assassin's tool, not a duelist's weapon. The existence and popularity of these crude, specialized weapons tells you everything you need to know about the true nature of frontier gun violence. It was about killing, not about honor. The historical debate over the prevalence and nature of dueling is one where historians are largely in agreement against the popular myth. They have meticulously researched court documents, coroner's reports, and newspaper articles from the period. The evidence is overwhelming. The Hollywood duel is a fantasy. The debate that still exists is why this myth became so powerful and persistent. Was it a way for a young nation to create a heroic, chivalric past for itself, borrowing from the older European tradition of aristocratic dueling? Did the dime novelists and, later, Hollywood filmmakers invent it simply because it was more dramatic and cinematic than a messy, drunken murder over a card game? The myth of the duel seems to serve a deep-seated need to believe that the violence of the past was somehow more noble and principled than the random, senseless violence of our own time. The brawl is starting to burn out. The initial burst of adrenaline is fading, replaced by pain and exhaustion. The big railroad worker who started it all is now sitting on the floor, holding his head and groaning. The trapper has a bleeding lip but looks otherwise unharmed. The bartender has finally waded in, grabbing one of the combatants by the collar and hauling him towards the door. The moment of crisis has passed. No guns were drawn. No one was dramatically shot. It was just a pathetic, ugly, and ultimately pointless explosion of drunken frustration. And in its own way, that is far more realistic and far more tragic than any movie shootout. Just as the brawl is fizzling out, the batwing doors squeak open and a new figure steps inside. He is a large man with a drooping mustache and a belly that strains the buttons of his vest. A tarnished silver star is pinned, slightly crooked, to his chest. This is the town marshal, the embodiment of the law. He doesn't stride in, hand hovering over his pistol. He ambles. He pauses for a moment, his eyes slowly taking in the scene. The overturned table, the groaning man on the floor, the bartender dragging another man towards the door. He shows no surprise, no urgency. He looks bored. He saunters over to the bar, ignoring the wreckage. "Even in, Gus," he says to the bartender, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Even in, Marshal." The bartender grunts, giving the man he's holding one last shove out the door into the dusty street. The marshal leans against the bar. "Looks like Billy had a little too much of your tarantula juice again. He'll have a headache in the morning." The bartender replies, already starting to right the overturned table. He owes for the chair, and that is it. That is the extent of the legal intervention. The marshal doesn't make any arrests. He doesn't take any statements. He doesn't even help clean up. He might accept a free drink from the bartender as an informal peacekeeping tax, and then he'll be on his way. This was the reality of law enforcement in many frontier towns. The lone, heroic sheriff who single-handedly cleans up a corrupt town is another powerful myth. In reality, lawmen were often underpaid, overworked, and deeply pragmatic. Their primary job wasn't to prevent crime or to enforce every single law on the books. It was to maintain a basic level of order and, most importantly, to ensure that the town's businesses, especially the saloons, which often paid a hefty portion of the town's taxes, could continue to operate profitably. A bar brawl, as long as it didn't result in a serious injury or death, was often seen as a private matter, a way for the men to sort out their own disputes. The marshal would only step in if things truly got out of hand, if guns were drawn, if someone was about to be killed, or if the fight threatened to spill out into the street and disturb the town's other residents. It was a form of selective, reactive policing. They weren't patrolling for trouble. They were waiting for trouble to become too big to ignore. A fascinating and weirdly specific detail of frontier law is the concept of carrying fees. In some towns, the marshal's salary was partially paid by fees he collected for making arrests, quite literally, carrying drunken, disorderly individuals to the town's flimsy jail, or calaboose. This created a strange incentive system. A marshal might ignore a simple fistfight, but be very quick to arrest a man for being publicly intoxicated, as it was an easy and direct way to supplement his meager income. Justice wasn't just blind, it was also driven by a profit motive. The very nature of the lawman in the West is a subject of continuous historical debate. The traditional view paints a black and white picture of heroic lawmen versus evil outlaws. But revisionist historians have shown that the line between the two was often incredibly blurry. Men frequently switched sides. A man might work as a lawman one season and an outlaw the next. Famous lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson were also professional gamblers and saloon owners. Their interest in keeping the peace was often directly tied to their own business interests. A peaceful town was a town where people felt safe enough to come and spend money at the gambling tables. So, was a lawman like Earp a civic-minded hero? Or was he a savvy businessman protecting his investments with a badge and a gun? The answer, most historians now agree, is a complex and messy both. The marshal finishes his drink, gives a lazy nod to the bartender, and turns to leave. He doesn't even glance at the men who were just fighting. They are no longer his problem. His presence was enough to signal that the party was over. He has done his job, which was not to punish the guilty, but simply to restore the saloon to its normal state of simmering, manageable chaos. He pushes through the swinging doors and disappears back into the night, leaving the inhabitants of the Prairie Rose Saloon to their own devices once more. The system, in its own strange, inefficient way, has worked. The brief interruption is over, and the business of drinking and losing money can resume. The brief, chaotic energy of the brawl has dissipated, leaving a vacuum in its wake. The bartender is muttering to himself as he wipes down the counter. The piano player has resumed his somber, looping melody, and the patrons are slowly returning to their drinks in their quiet desperation. Your attention is drawn back to the poker table, the one where the young cowboy lost his entire stake earlier in the evening. A new game is underway, but one of the players from that fateful hand is still there. The old, hollow-eyed man. He was already down to his last few coins when you first saw him. Now, he has nothing. He's not playing anymore. He's just sitting there, staring at the cards being dealt to the other players. His chair is pulled back slightly from the table, a clear signal that he is out of the game. The other players ignore him completely. He is invisible, a ghost at the feast. He watches one more hand play out, his face a blank mask of resignation. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he pushes his chair back and stands up. He doesn't walk towards the door. Instead, he approaches the bartender, his steps slow and unsteady. He leans on the bar, and you can just overhear his quiet, raspy voice. "Gus," he says, his voice cracking slightly. "Just one more. On credit. I'm good for it. You know I am." The bartender, Gus, doesn't even look up from the glass he's polishing. His response is flat, devoid of emotion. "No, please, Gus, I got a steak coming in. Just a small one, to tide me over." The answer's no. "Abner," the bartender says, his voice a little firmer now. "You know the rules. No credit." He finally looks at the old man, his eyes cold and hard. "Time to go home. I ain't got a home to go to." The old man whispers, his shoulders slumping. "This is the final, brutal transaction of the saloon. When your money runs out, your welcome runs out." The saloon is not a charity. It is not a shelter. It is a business. And a patron with no money is no longer a patron. He is just taking up space. Gus the bartender jerks his head towards the door. A silent, final command. The old man, Dabner, lingers for a moment, a flicker of hope dying in his eyes. Then, he turns and begins the slow, shuffling walk towards the entrance. This is the bum's rush. The unceremonious ejection of a man who has outlived his utility. He is not thrown out violently like the brawler was. That would be a waste of energy. He is simply discarded. As he reaches the swinging doors, he pauses. He looks back at the room. The hazy light, the hunched figures at the tables, the smudged mirror behind the bar. For all its grime and desperation, this was his world. This was his community, and he has just been exiled from it. He pushes through the doors and is gone, swallowed by the darkness outside. A bizarre and rather sad detail of his process was the wood list. In some saloons, a man who was completely broke could perform menial tasks in exchange for a drink. He might be asked to chop wood for the stove, sweep the floor, or clean the spit mess. His name would be put on a list, and he could work off his debt to the saloon. This wasn't an act of charity. It was a way for the saloon owner to get free labor and to keep a desperate man tethered to the establishment, in the hope that he might one day come into money again. The historical treatment of poverty and addiction on the frontier is a grim subject. While there were some community efforts and charitable organizations in larger, more established towns, in a raw boom town like this one, there was no social safety net. You were entirely on your own. If you lost your job, your health, or your money, there was no one to catch you. The saloon, in a perverse way, often functioned as the last stop before complete destitution. As long as you had a single coin, you could buy a drink and a few hours of warmth and company. When that last coin was gone, you were cast out into a world that had no place for you. Historians debate whether this harsh individualism was a defining characteristic of the Western character or simply a product of circumstance. Was there a genuine belief that every man should stand on his own defeat, and that failure was a personal, moral failing? Or was the lack of social support simply a practical reality in new, under-resourced communities that were struggling to establish themselves? Some argue for the former, pointing to the powerful ideology of self-reliance in American culture. Others argue for the latter, suggesting that people would have been more charitable if they had the resources to be. The truth is likely a combination of both. A harsh ideology thriving in a harsh environment. The door swings shut behind Abner. Inside the saloon, it acts as if he never existed. Another man has already taken his seat at the poker table. The bartender is serving another drink. The machine keeps running, indifferent to the fate of one small, broken part. You realize that the greatest danger in this saloon isn't the threat of a brawl or a crooked card game. It is the threat of becoming invisible, of having your last dollar run out and being cast into the cold, unforgiving darkness. The night wears on, and a strange transformation comes over the saloon. The clock on the wall, its face yellowed and stained, ticks past midnight. The initial chaotic energy of the evening has burned away, leaving behind a thick, heavy residue of exhaustion. The crowd has thinned. The boisterous cowboys, having spent their pay, have stumbled out. The more cautious or successful gamblers have cashed in their chips and departed. The con man, having fleeced his mark, has vanished as if he were never there. What is left is the core clientele, the true regulars, the ones who have nowhere else to go. The room is quieter now, the roaring babble reduced to a lull. Intermittent murmur. The smoke seems thicker, heavier, as if it, too, is tired of swirling and has settled into a stagnant fog. The light from the kerosene lamps seems dimmer, casting long, distorted shadows that dance like specters on the walls. This is the witching hour in the Prairie Rose Saloon, and you are seeing its inhabitants in their most unfiltered state. The masks have come off. The forced smiles of the saloon girls have faded into expressions of pure, bone-deep weariness. One of them is asleep at a back table, her head resting on her arms, her painted face looking tragic and dull like in the gloom. Another stares blankly at the wall, slowly sipping a glass of water, her thoughts 1,000 miles away. Their work is mostly done. The big spenders are gone. Now, they just have to wait for the night to end. The piano player is still at his post, but his playing has become even more sparse and melancholy. The repetitive tunes have given way to slow, disjointed chords, fragments of songs that sound like half-remembered lullabies. It is the sound of a music box slowly winding down. The men who remain are the true lost souls. The haunted veteran is still in his corner, nursing what might be his 3rd or his 10th drink of the night. His stare is unfocused, his body rigid. He is deep inside his own private war, and the saloon is his foxhole. At the bar, a few miners sit slumped over their glasses, no longer talking, just drinking with a grim, methodical determination. They are not drinking for pleasure or for social connection. They are drinking to forget the darkness of the mind, the danger of their work, and the crushing loneliness of their life. They are drinking to achieve oblivion. You see a side of these men that is hidden during the brighter, louder hours. You see the vulnerability beneath the bravado. You see the fear behind the aggression. In the harsh light of day, they are strong, self-reliant frontiersmen. But here, in the dying hours of the night, they are just tired, lonely men, seeking a temporary solace in a bottle and a shared smoky room. A strange and poignant detail of late night's saloon life was the free lunch. During the day, many saloons offered a spread of free food to entice customers. Salty ham, crackers, cheese, pickles. The salty food, of course, was designed to make patrons thirsty and encourage them to buy more beer. By midnight, the free lunch is a pathetic sight. It has a plate of stale, curling crackers, a few slimy-looking pickles, and the dried-out heel of a ham, all sitting on the end of the bar, picked over and ignored. It is a perfect metaphor for the saloon itself, a promise of nourishment that, by the end of the night, is revealed to be nothing but stale leftovers. The very concept of time in a saloon is something historians of social habits find fascinating. The saloon was a place designed to make you lose track of time. The windows were often grimy or shuttered, disconnecting the interior from the natural cycle of day and night. The constant, artificial light of the lamps, the steady flow of alcohol, and the repetitive noise were all designed to suspend normal life, to create a bubble where the only thing that mattered was the next string, the next hand of cards. The debate is whether this was a benevolent function, offering a much-needed escape, or a predatory one, designed to keep men spending money long after they should have gone home. Was the saloon a refuge from time, or a thief of it? You look at the faces around you. The young, hopeful prospector you saw earlier has been replaced by the grim, silent miner. The cocky, paid-off cowboy has been replaced by the broke, exiled abber. The witty, glamorous saloon girl of myth has been replaced by the exhausted, sleeping woman at the back table. This is the saloon with its makeup off, its mask removed. It is not a place of adventure. It is a place of stasis. It is a waiting room for the end of the night, for the start of another day of hard labor, or, for some, for the end of the line. The air is thick with the ghosts of spent money and shattered dreams. The bartender, Gus, pulls a pocket watch from his vest. He clicks it open, squints at the face, and then snaps it shut. With a decisive click, he reaches up and turns down the wick on the nearest kerosene lamp. The light gutters and shrinks, plunging one corner of the room into deeper shadow. It is a signal. The night is over. "All right, you hyenas," he says, his voice not loud, but carrying a finality that cuts through the lethargy. "Drink him up, or take him with you. The party is over." There is no protest, just a series of low groans and the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. The remaining patrons, moving like men in a trance, down the last of their drinks. The spell is broken. The timeless bubble of the saloon has been burst by the mundane reality of closing time. The process of shutting down the Prairie Rose is a slow, wary ritual. Gus moves with the practiced efficiency of a man who has done this thousands of times. He collects the dirty, sticky glasses, dunking them in the tub of murky rinse water that will sit there until morning. He doesn't wash them. He just gets the worst of the grime off. One of the saloon girls gently shakes her sleeping companion awake. The woman looks up. disoriented, her face smudged with makeup. They exchange a few quiet words, then pull their shawls tightly around their shoulders and head for the back staircase. Their footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet room, they disappear into the darkness upstairs. Their workday finally, mercifully, at an end. The piano player plays one last, discordant chord, as if his fingers just fell onto the keys. He closes the keyboard cover with a soft thud that sounds as loud as a gunshot in the near silence. He stands up stiffly, stretches his back, and without a word to anyone, shuffles out the front door, melting into the pre-dawn gloom. The ghost has left the machine. The last of the drinkers, the silent veteran and a couple of miners, file out slowly. They don't say goodnight. They just leave. Hunched against a cold, they feel on the inside as much as the out. The swinging doors squeak a final, weary complaint for each of them. Now, it is just you and Gus. The silence is profound. All that is left is the low hiss of the remaining lamps and the faint ringing in your ears. Gus grabs a broom and begins to sweep. But he is not just sweeping sawdust. He is sweeping up the detritus of a dozen broken stories. He sweeps up spent matches, discarded rolling papers, a single, forgotten playing card, the two of clubs, and a few stray, worthless coins that aren't even worth bending over for. The sawdust, which started the night as a clean, absorbent layer, is now a dark, foul-smelling carpet of filth. A specific and rather disgusting detail of closing time was dealing with a split mess. This was the final, and worst, job of the night. Gus carries them, one by one, to the back door. He doesn't take them far. He just opens the door and empties the vial, semi-liquid contents, into the back alley. The splattering sound is obscene in the quiet night. This alleyway, which served countless saloons in towns across the West, was an open sewer of tobacco juice, stale beer, and other unspeakable things. It was the saloon's hidden, ugly secret. The historical study of waste in the 19th century is a surprisingly rich field. Historians who focus on urban and environmental history look at things like saloon waste to understand the realities of sanitation before modern infrastructure. The saloon alley is a perfect microcosm of the frontier attitude towards the environment, a place of seemingly infinite space, where you could simply throw your problems out the back door and forget about them. The long-term consequences were not a concern. The debate centers on whether this was a result of ignorance about hygiene and the environment, or a conscious choice born of convenience and a focus on short-term profit. Looking at Gus dump the spit, it feels overwhelmingly like the latter. He finishes his sweeping, piling the dirty sawdust into a corner to be shoveled out in the morning. He walks along the bar, wiping it down with a rag that seems to spread the grime around more than it removes it. He turns down the last of the lamps, plunging the room into almost complete darkness. The only light now a pale, pre-dawn gray filtering through the filthy windows. The saloon, which just a few hours ago was a roaring, chaotic beacon of life, is now a dead, silent shell. It looks like the scene of a crime, which, in many ways, it is. The air is stale and heavy with the ghosts of the night. It is a hollow, lonely place. Gus bolts the front door. A heavy, final sound. The Prairie Rose Saloon is closed. You step out of the saloon's orbit, back into the crisp, clean air of the emerging dawn. The contrast is breathtaking. The oppressive, recycled air of the saloon is replaced by the cool, earthy smell of the prairie. The sky to the east is no longer black, but is soft, bruised purple, with a thin, brilliant line of orange appearing on the horizon. The stars are beginning to fade, their cold fire extinguished by the approaching sun. The town, which was just a collection of dark shapes when you arrived, is now slowly resolving into view, and in the honest, unforgiving light of morning, the illusion of the previous night is shattered completely. You look back at the Prairie Rose Saloon. The false front that looked vaguely impressive in the darkness now looks pathetic and absurd. The paint is peeling. The wood is warped and splintered. You can see every crack, every nail hole, every stain. The grand facade is a cheap costume, and the sun is exposing it for what it is. The street is empty, save for a stray dog sniffing at a pile of trash. The silence is broken only by the distant crowing of a rooster and the ever-present whisper of the wind. The light spilling from the saloon windows is gone, and the building looks blind and abandoned. It is hard to believe that just a few hours ago, this drab, lifeless box was the vibrant, chaotic center of the universe. The morning light is cruel to the whole town. The other buildings look just as shabby and temporary. The main street is revealed to be nothing more than a wide track of dirt, littered with trash and scarred with wagon ruts. The grand adventure of the Wild West looks, in the light of day, like a tired, dusty, and rather impoverished affair. This stark difference between the night and the day was a fundamental rhythm of frontier life. The night, fueled by alcohol and artificial light, was a time for myth-making, for fantasy, for escaping the harsh realities of the world. The saloon was the theater where these fantasies were played out. But the morning always came, the sun always rose, and with it came the cold, hard light of sobriety and the resumption of back-breaking labor. The man who was a king at the poker table last night is, this morning, just a miner facing another 10 hours underground. The woman who is a glittering object of desire is just a tired employee facing another day in a place she can't escape. A small but revealing detail is what you might find on the ground outside a saloon in the morning. Alongside the expected trash, you'd find things that tell a story of the night before. A single dropped glove, a torn piece of a letter, a few scattered playing cards from an argument, and perhaps a tooth. These were the archaeological remnants of the previous night's drama. Small, forgotten pieces of people's lives left behind in the dust. The historical perception of the saloon is often tied to this day-night dichotomy. Those who defended the saloon, the wits, tended to speak of it in terms of its nighttime function, a place of community, camaraderie, and much-needed relaxation after a hard day's work. They saw it as a vital social institution. But those who attacked it, the Dreesen, the members of the temperance movement, always described it in the cold light of day. They pointed to the poverty, the violence, and the broken families that were the hangover of the saloon's nightly party. The ongoing historical debate is essentially an argument over which time of day gives the truer picture. Was the saloon the joyful, necessary escape it appeared to be at 10 p. Or the source of misery and decay appeared to be at 6. You start to walk down the deserted street. A few lights are appearing in the windows of the other buildings. The town is slowly waking up. The blacksmith's forge will soon be fired up, its rhythmic clanging replacing the tinny sound of the saloon piano. The general store will open its doors. The cycle of work is beginning again, powered by the money that was spent and lost in the saloon just hours ago. The saloon is the engine of the town's economy, but it runs on a fuel of desperation and dreams, and its exhaust is the harsh reality you see all around you in the morning light. The Prairie Rose Saloon sits there, silent and ugly, waiting for the sun to go down so it can put its mask back on until it lies all over again. You walk to the edge of the small, dusty town, leaving the main street behind. The sun is higher now. How brilliant! Warm morn that floods the landscape with golden light. The prairie, which seemed so dark and intimidating last night, is now a vast, rolling sea of green and gold grasses, dotted with wildflowers. It is beautiful, peaceful, and profoundly indifferent. You find yourself drawn to a small, fenced-off patch of ground on a low hill overlooking the town. It is the local cemetery, though cemetery is too grand a word for it. It is a bony, a brute hill. There are perhaps 24 graves, most of them marked with simple, weathered wooden crosses, or just a pile of rocks. The names, if they were ever painted on the wood, have long since been scoured away by the relentless wind and sun. These are the forgotten ones. The man shot in a pointless argument over a card game. The prospector who drank himself to death after his claim ran dry. The young cowboy who caught a fever and had no one to care for him. The saloon girl who died of disease or during a botched medical procedure. This is the final destination for many who pass through the doors of the Prairie Rose Saloon. Their grand adventure was ended here, in an unmarked grave on a lonely hill. The saloon, you realize, was not just a stopping point on the road to fortune. For many, it was the road itself. a circular path that led from the front door to the back alley, and eventually to this windswept hill. It was a machine that chewed up hope and spit out ghosts. Every cheer at the faro table, every desperate bet at the poker game, every glass of tarantula juice poured was a small step on a path that could easily end here. You think of the men and women inside the saloon last night, the hollow-eyed veteran, the desperate gambler Abner, the exhausted saloon girls. They are all caught in the saloon-esque gravitational pull. It offers them a fleeting sense of life, of community, of hope. But the price is entanglement in a system designed to strip them of their money, their health, and their future. The saloon gives with one hand and takes with the other. And the house always wins. In the end, the ultimate house advantage is this. The saloon gets to open its doors again tomorrow night, while its patrons end up here. A final, poignant piece of trivia lies in the name Boot Hill. The most famous Boot Hill Cemetery is in Tombstone, Arizona, but there were many others. The name came from the fact that many of its occupants died suddenly and violently. With their boots on, it was a place for peaceful, natural deaths. It was a testament to a life that was often short, brutal, and cheap. It was the final, unglamorous ledger of the Wild West's true costs. The historical legacy of the saloon is still a subject of passionate debate. Was it the engine of Western expansion, the social glue that held these fragile communities together? A place where deals were made and civilization was forged in a crucible of chaos? Or was it a predatory parasite, an institution that exploited the lonely and the desperate, fueled addiction and violence, and hindered the establishment of a more stable, family-oriented society? The truth, as we've seen, is that it was both. It was the heart of the community and the cancer within it. It was a place of vibrant life and a harbinger of slow death. It was a stage for dreams and a graveyard for dreamers. You look from the silent, forgotten graves back down to the town. The Prairie Rose Saloon sits there, squat and ugly in the morning sun. From this distance, it looks small, insignificant against the vastness of the prairie. But you know the power it holds. You know the stories that unfold within its walls every single night. The Hollywood myth of the charming, adventurous saloon is just that, a myth. A beautiful, entertaining lie. The reality was a much grimmer, dirtier, and more desperate affair. It was a place not of heroes, but of survivors and victims, and its truest monument is not a grand statue in the center of town, but this quiet, lonely collection of unmarked graves, whispering their stories to the endless wind. The night has been long, and the journey has taken us through some dark and dusty corners of the past. The noise of the saloon has faded now, replaced by the gentle hum of your own quiet room. The flickering kerosene lamps have given way to the soft glow of your screen, or perhaps just the darkness behind your closed eyelids. The stories of those lost souls, the gambler, the veteran, the girl with the painted-on smile, begin to melt and blur, becoming less like history and more like the start of a dream. Let the harsh edges of that world soften. The smell of stale smoke and cheap whiskey is gone, replaced by the clean scent of your pillows. The sound of the tinny, out-of-tune piano fades into the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. You are no longer on a rickety boardwalk in a dangerous town. You are safe. You are comfortable. You are drifting on a quiet current, away from the dust and the noise, towards a place of deep and restful slumber. Let the last vestiges of the Prairie Rose Saloon dissolve into the peaceful darkness of your own mind. The stories are over now. It is time to rest. The end of the article. Good night.